This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco. I'm safe when I reach San Antonio. He glanced back over his shoulder.
Welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. I have brought back my co-host for the Crossroads series as an expert. He's been out doing research. Rick Tullis has been doing research on an interesting case that he brought to my attention a while back and was fascinated with it. And so, Rick...
Well, Stephen, I would say when I was doing the research for the Crossroads series, and which was very expansive. I mean, we had a lot of topics.
Yeah.
To your chagrin.
Yes.
And there were several cases where I'd come across an interesting personality. I'm like, okay, they really don't fit into any of those episodes in any way. But I'm like, I'm just going to put a little check mark by that name and maybe come back to that later. And this is one of those. This is an individual with a very interesting story, with success and failure and tragedy. I mean, it's got everything. It's a great story. It's got steampunk kind of technology and pushing the envelope of the world, and it happened all here in McLennan County.
All right, and so we're talking about the story of WD Custead and the adventures of, you said WD stands for what?
William Downing. William Downing Custead.
Okay, so who was William Downing Custead?
Well, and something I want to mention first before we get started, and we maybe add a little bit more to it at the end. A lot of this information, I found bits and pieces on the internet, some articles, maybe a little bit here and there. There was a little booklet put together by a guy here locally back in the 70s, I think 1974, Nick Pocock, and so we're going to rely heavily on his manuscript. He did a lot of that research at the Texas Collection. He gives a lot of credit to the Texas Collection, and probably you if you'd been there, but you weren't.
Yeah,
at that time.
I was. You
were like
6.
Yeah,
I was learning the alphabet, I believe.
Okay, well, you would have been a lot of help.
Yeah.
So, and he's Pocock's kind of an interesting guy too. We'll maybe do a little aside about him at the end, but yeah, WD Custead. Let's set the scene a little bit.
Yeah,
first.
Go ahead. Paint us a picture.
Yes, close your eyes a second, and let me take you back to the late 1800s. So flight had not happened, and the idea of people being able to fly, although we totally take it for granted now. I mean, it is.
Well, we had balloons.
There were balloons.
Yeah, there were dirigibles, but
powered flight. And balloons
motorized,
really hadn't been around that long, honestly.
Motorized flight did not exist.
Powered controlled flight was what birds did. And there wasn't a lot of science around it. A lot of people tried things. You just think everybody's seen the black and whites of people flapping wings and jumping off buildings and crashing horribly. That was real. I mean, people were trying a lot of different ideas, and of course, they relied heavily on birds. A lot of what they saw birds do, they tried to emulate, which is really hard to do with a machine. The birds have obviously a lot of control surfaces they can move, and the way they power themselves. I mean, it's just you can't replicate that with a machine.
I remember the old video, a lot of attempts at flapping, trying to create some sort of flapping device that could go airborne. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Which reminds me, being a former comedian yourself, the old punchline, man, I just flew in from Toledo.
Yeah, boy, are my arms tired.
Yeah, there you go. So, also, the other analogy a lot of people had was of sailing ships. I mean, ships had been around for millennia. Yeah. And water is a fluid, and that just like air is a fluid. So a lot of the ideas, in fact, the people calling things airships. I mean, a lot of it's a connection to a vehicle that people were already familiar with. Okay, so we get in the late 1800s. There's at least enough technology change. People are honestly trying to make an attempt at flight.
Mm-hmm.
And as people get closer, there's actually a recognition that, hey, it would be really good. Flight could be a powerful thing, and the U.S. government actually put out they passed a piece of legislation to give prize money to the first person or people that could come up with a flying machine and prove that it works and all that stuff. Okay, so in 1899, the Congress actually passed a bill appropriating $125,000 for the pursuit of inquiries into practicable flying machines. Of this appropriation, $100,000 of it was to be paid as a prize to the first fortunate inventor whose design is accepted and approved as the most feasible and practicable. And then they had the other money for other things. Because you can obviously think of the advantage in commerce and military and all that stuff. So, and governments have long used incentives like prize money to get the inventive and scientific and entrepreneurial communities to come up with, new ideas and new things for their for the country.
I just did the calculation for you.
Oh, I've actually done it too.
Oh, have you really?
Tell me what you got.
3.7 million.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
we both got the.
Yeah.
So that would be
it's quite a handsome reward.
3.7 million
in today's dollars. Yeah,
it is. But when you think what it would take to create a flying device, it's probably a little light.
Mm-hmm.
It's fun to think about in McLennan County. We still get to enjoy kind of this pressing the envelope of flight because we get to hear the rocket tests at in McGregor at SpaceX, who are trying to get to Mars, which is kind of one of those things that's out there that we have not put a person to Mars yet. Kind of the next stage of the frontier. So it's actually kind of ironic. 125 years later, we've gone from just getting someone in the air to now getting them to Mars. I mean, that's
pretty impressive.
Kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah.
All right, so back to WD Custead.
WD.
Sorry, WD.
Yeah.
So he was born in 1867, April 14th, 1867, in Milford, Delaware, to some French parents. He was a distant, I actually don't know how close of a cousin. I tried to find a family tree when I saw that he was connected or related, a cousin to Buffalo Bill Cody.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The only thing I found was Buffalo Bill Cody had about 12 kids. So your odds of being related.
We're all related to Buffalo Bill Cody.
I'm sorry, his dad had 12 kids. Okay. So odds of being related were pretty high. And he ended up in Elmont, Texas. Yeah, he was born in 1867. Elmont was established in 1867 as well. But then later on, he, as an employee of the railroad, ends up as a dispatcher for the Katy Railway in about 1896-ish or so.
Okay.
So he was a member of the Brotherhood of Telegraphers.
Interesting. Yeah. So he's at the cutting edge of technology himself.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it. I mean, railroads and communication, telegraphs. Of note, and this is brought up in Pocock's book, that's right about the time that the crash at Crush happened. And
September 15th.
And it was between Elmont and
1896
West.
with the Katy Railroad.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a great episode of the Waco History Podcast.
Yeah.
Go check that out.
Yeah. So, big national event. He certainly would have seen there or been part of it. I would guess. So around 1897, I guess Custead, at least as far as we know, I mean, he didn't keep great records. We don't really have a diary, so a lot of this information is pieced together But he started fooling around and building models of of his version of an airship, and people start kind of. There are witnesses that saw what was going on in Elmont, so there is proof, I guess, witness proof that.
So he has a workshop
some of this is
out there in Elmont that he's
tinkering
away at.
He's using a shed not too
Okay.
far from the railroad.
Okay.
Maybe even been a railroad shed that he was building this thing, and his design. I guess let me try to describe it for you, because that'll help our listeners understand at least what was going on in his mind. And a little this goes back to what I was saying a minute ago. A lot of these inventors were taking things they knew and trying to extrapolate them into the next thing, right? So his airship, basically, if you looked at a drawing of him, and he did submit patents, and we'll get to that in a minute. I mean, he did go to D.C. and do his, part to try to get the prize. I would say it looks a little bit like an oversized canoe. So think of that shape with 4 large bladed paddles on each side.
Okay.
And, fan, like think of when wafting a big fan on you, which I'm sure at home happens for you all the time.
It does, and at work,
people
yeah.
are taking care of you. So those things hanging off the side of the hulls, and he had a mechanism that he could connect to a motor of some sort, and we'll talk about the different motor technologies at the time. But that would drive these gears and linkages and coordinate the flapping of these big fans.
Okay.
And that would generate the lift to raise the canoe-like fuselage off the ground.
Okay.
And, he claimed then by speeding up or slowing down the flapping on either side, you could control directionally where you're going or the speed.
You could take a left by kind of slowing down one side, speeding up another side. I see it. Yeah.
And that was the idea. And it talked in there, too, of creating a little bit of buoyance in the canoe-like structure by adding some bags of helium or hydrogen, which would reduce your power requirements, obviously, to get off the ground.
Okay.
So apparently he constructed some models and got them to kind of fly around a little bit. So then went to...
Oh, wait, hold on. Did he get them to fly around? Do we have like eyewitnesses of people saying they saw these things flying around, these models?
Yeah. So, there were. He was not too far from the elementary school or the school.
Okay.
So the kids, in Elmont. So there were later on, the author and some other people went back and interviewed some of those eyewitnesses
out at recess and what they would see at recess.
Yeah. I mean, after school was out, you go see what the crazy guy was doing in the shed, and they talked about it. They talked about this thing started flapping, and it was held down by ropes that were connected to some scales, so he could measure his lift.
Oh.
And this thing would fly up and pull against the ropes, and there were several people that said they saw that happen. So, and so those would have been the smaller ones. So he decides to go full scale. And so let me read a little bit. Here's an article that came out from the Fairfield Recorder.
Most big stories are broken.
At the Fairfield Reporter. And so I'll just, a little excerpt there. WD Custead, who went to Washington several weeks ago to submit his invention, solving the problem of aerial navigation for the consideration of the Board of Ordnance and Fortifications of the War Department, returned to his home at Elmont, McLennan County, bringing with him the highest commendation of those who had investigated his invention. So he goes to D.C., says, "Hey, here's this invention, and I've been successful." I'm pretty sure, usually at that point, to you would submit a patent with your plans, and usually they required some kind of model. In fact, if you go, if you're in D.C. and you go to like the American History Museum or something like that, you can see a lot of these old models of some of these cool inventions. Best I could tell, none of his survived. So
when was this, Rick? When does he go to? Do you have a sense of when he goes to D.C. to try?
Well, this article was written February 17th, 1899.
Okay.
So it said 2 weeks before then. So January of 99. And to give some perspective here too, the Wright brothers are credited with the first controlled flight in 1903. So, we're roughly 4 years ahead of them. And there's a whole controversy there with the Wright brothers, which, there are many people who claim to have flown before them.
Yeah.
And there's some nuances in to that discussion. But back to Custead.
Yeah.
So our local hero here. So in speaking on the subject, Mr. Custead said, "Every hope and every expectation I had when I left Texas 3 weeks ago has been realized and confirmed by both the War Department and by the Patent Office. I was assured that my idea, as shown in my invention, was distinctly original, and in addition, it was pronounced to be the key to success in the achievement of practical aerial navigation."
Wow.
He's not overselling it.
No.
Well, maybe a little.
Yeah, probably.
So, the article goes on. They described in the article, and I'll do this again, the actual device. And so it says, and this is a quote of Custead describing his invention. "The principle involved in my machine is a combination of balloon, bird wing, and aeroplane as applied. However, as to conflict with no particular or any other device on record." So it was a big deal, right? Even now, you don't want to, if you copy somebody else's patents, that can be a big deal. So the hull is semi-cigar or canoe shaped, pointed at both ends, and can be made of any desired size. My ship is that, my idea is that if my invention is adopted, the airships will be made of many and varying sizes, some being as large as ocean liners, and fitted with every comfort for travel as are ocean-going vessels today. It is practical to do this with my invention. The hull is entirely enclosed and covered, and with the exception of cabin space in the center for the occupancy of the operator and passengers, forms a reservoir which is filled with hydrogen gas, the lightest gas known, in order to reduce the weight and maintain the equilibrium as the matter of safety in case of an accident. Of course, we know today that accidents with hydrogen have other outcomes, but that's all right. I mean, the propelling power consists of any number of series of blades or wings operated from each upper side of the machine and connected in such a manner that the mechanisms of the motor that they offer absolutely no resistance to the air currents in their upward and forward motion. The machine is under direct control of the operator as to elevation and steering, is positive and safe in its actions and operation, and is admitted and pronounced by the most advanced students in aeronavigation to be the first and only practical solution of this problem that has ever been made.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think back to that water paradigm. Think about, when you teach your kids to swim, or when we swim, right? If you're doing something like a breaststroke, you keep your hands flat as you're pushing it forward through the water, and then when you're making your stroke, you turn your hands to get as much water as you can to push back off of. So I can imagine that's how his little flapping wings were working, right? They were going up and then pushing back.
Yeah. Like a paddle.
Right.
Like a paddle.
Right.
Yeah.
Scientifically, there's a few challenges there, right? I mean, water and air don't act exactly the same. Water's incompressible, so as much as you push against it, you have a much firmer surface, where air is a compressible surface and much less dense, obviously. So some of the physics don't work out quite the same, I think, which ended up being part of his challenge. So he ends up finding some local folks to invest in his
Yeah,
venture.
that's what I wondered. I mean, he's got to have patrons, right? I mean, because if he's going to build this full size, it's going to cost some money.
Yeah. And speaking of money, a lot of the internal combustion engine was like super new right then too. I mean, that was cutting edge.
Yeah.
Still, steam engines were the thing of the day. And obviously, firing a steam engine inside of an airship was not going to really work out too good for you. I mean, very heavy. Now something really hot. Lots of challenges there. But I thought this was interesting. He wrote, there are many motors available of various prices and power in proportion to weight. But I am of the opinion that a gasoline motor manufactured by the St. Louis Gasoline Motor Company, weighing 25 pounds per horsepower and costing less than $200 for a 2-horsepower motor, would prove sufficiently satisfactory for operating my first machine.
Oh my gosh! So, do we know total horsepower? Does that suggest he's
thinking all he needs is 2 horsepower.
2 horsepower to operate.
2 horsepower. I mean, what's your lawnmower?
yeah, mine's 4, I think. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I mean, not very much. And then you think of the weight, and again, the internal combustion engine was kind of early in its design phases too, but 25 pounds per horsepower. So I looked up what a modern aircraft engine for a propeller-driven internal combustion engine. So I was finding things along the lines of 1.8 to 2 pounds per horsepower, not 25 pounds per horsepower. So interesting. And when you look at what the Wright brothers did, that was the key to their flight. They finally got a gasoline-powered engine that powered their propellers, their early propellers. That was what enabled them to get off the ground. So kind of the intersection of a couple different technologies making it feasible. Okay, but we were mentioning something about his venture. So he ends up creating something called the Custead Airship Company, and he raises $100,000 in stock. Sells it to a lot of local folks, and he had just like any corporation, it needed officers and directors. So it was formed in April 12th, 1900, capital stock being $100,000. So he was the president, a guy named C.M. Curry, vice president, E.G. Irwin, secretary treasurer. George Clark was the counsel. So George Clark is an interesting character in Waco history as well. He could have fit in maybe some of our earlier podcasts. He was... at that time, he was age 59, and he was the president of the Waco Gas Company, and he also had helped organize the First National Bank. He had also been a prominent railroad attorney. He ran for governor and was not successful. So we talked earlier about the Waco being a political center for Texas.
A crossroads, I think, is what the term we used.
Crossroads is a good way to describe it. And but he was defeated. Was still ended up being Secretary of State of Texas. So very accomplished man. So if you're going to build something and you want to get people that, you want to raise money, but you want to be more considered not a fluke or a quack. Yeah, you get some prominent people involved with your organization. So that's obviously what he did. Some of the other people, Charles Hamilton was general manager for the Texas Central Railroad, so some of his buddies in the railroad business. Another guy was I mentioned Charles Curry, attorney here in Texas, or in Waco. So he kind of built his team.
Yeah, and I see the letterhead you have there that he used. It's got the rendering of his flying machine there at the top of the letterhead.
Yeah.
Or airship, sorry.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, and to be totally accurate, an ornithopter.
That's what it's called, an ornithopter.
Right.
Yeah.
So if ornithopters are flying machines that mimic the flight of birds.
Oh, okay.
In some way.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, if you Googled it,
Yeah.
And pulled up ornithopter, there are several flying versions now, like little model versions. You can even some how-to videos on how to build one, and wind it up with a rubber band and let it go, and it flaps around the room. It's really cool. But so those are ornithopters.
Interesting.
Now, he probably didn't have that word at the time.
Yeah.
So that's more of our modern way of discussing it. So his big claim to fame was flying this, the flying version, the larger flying version, flying it from Elmont to Tokyo, Texas.
Yeah. Well, it took me a second, but I realized you were saying Tokyo, Texas. Yeah.
And back to back to Elmont.
Okay.
And he claims that flight would have been the first, powered manned flight. Again, before.
So how far is that?
The Kitty
That is that's quite a flight.
Yeah,
Tokyo's
if you
not
look
that
at it,
close.
it's about I think a mile or so from Elmont.
Okay.
So if you so the railroads, and there may still be a rail line that runs that direction. I don't know. I don't think there is. I think there's still the rail line that runs kind of parallel to I-35 for a while up past through west. But there at Elmont, just past that, there was a switch, and one of them kind of went up towards Tokyo.
Okay.
That's Tokyo.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so in another article, now this was written a little bit later in 1949. Someone locally had gone back. In fact, this was printed in the Waco Tribune-Herald. And so it says, 6 years before Orville and Wilbur Wright lifted their plane off the field at Kitty Hawk in 1903, a quiet little Frenchman, a ticket agent for the Katy Railroad, WD Custead by name, flew a plane of his own design from Elmont to Tokyo, McLennan County, Tokyo, and back a distance of about 5 miles. So that answers our question of that round trip distance.
But that date doesn't work with the rest of the timeline, right? I mean, that would have been 1897, and that's before. So anyway, before he had a supposedly had a full size rig, right?
Yeah. So there's definitely some challenges here, and this may be one of the reasons he wasn't fully believed as the first inventor of a manned flight. And the article goes on and kind of he gives more detail around what happened and some other people he introduced into the process. Like, he originally started with a bamboo structure for the fuselage, but that was too heavy. So then he employed one of the local bicycle shops. So bicycles were a thing back then, right? They were that was a cutting edge of technology. So he had these bike shops and these guys in there who knew how to make frames out of tubular steel, and so that was his next rendition, was a tubular steel model that could hold up more. Because you can imagine with the flapping wings, you got a lot of forces acting that could tear something up pretty fast. And he eventually, I guess didn't make the progress he wanted to make, realized that the engine part was, I think, a huge part of being successful.
Yeah.
He thought his concept was sound, that the canoe, the flapping wing canoe, was a sound.
So the design was good, but he needed to refine the power source.
I gotta get the power source. So he ends up hooking up with a guy named Gustav Whitehead up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Now, if you dive into Gustav's history, I mean, he was a legitimate contender for first in flight and ended up doing some things. he was building things that looked more like a modern airplane. They had wings and a tail. Again, probably has some recorded successes that probably put him close, and some people argue to be the first in flight. But he goes up there to join forces with him, with Whitehead. I think my guess would be mainly because of his engine technology and helping him figure it out. So they worked together for a while, and it kind of there's some articles that talk about their partnership. In fact, there's one in the Bridgeport, Connecticut newspaper that says, and I quote, with the purpose in view of perfecting a flying machine that will solve the problem of aerial navigation to the point of commercial success, Gustav Whitehead of this city and WD Custead of Waco, Texas, have formed a partnership. Both men are inventors. And then it goes on to describe, what they've done and what they've flown, and says, Mr. Whitehead last Tuesday night with 2 assistants took his machine to a long field in the back of Fairfield, and the inventor for the first time flew in his machine for half a mile. Again, so that's, that was 1901, August 19th, 1901 is when this article came out. So some people say, well, Gustav might have been the first one to fly. Now, it doesn't really, it talks a little bit about more their partnership. Mr. Custead is backed by several Texas and Southern capitalists for the manufacture of the new airship. The company is capitalized at $100,000. Mr. Custead is now in New York. The good points of both inventors' flying machines will be included in the new machine in this combination of a new engine that describes, will produce, so there's this kind of hope it'll produce the right deal. And then the story kind of fades, it kind of dies. So Custead's up in New York. He's got this partnership with.
So he's relocated up there.
His family's still here.
Okay.
He left them here to go up there to work on this thing. And there's actually nothing else that, at least in the public record, that talks about this partnership. Now, in 1904, Custead does apply for some more patents relating to variable speed mechanisms and shows himself to be a resident of New York. And it's not really discussed how those were applied, if he still had a machine he was trying to do or not. The footnote is here: sadly, Custead's family back in Elmont did not see him again and only heard of him occasionally over the years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what was in the mind of the man, but it sounds like he went up there. Things didn't really work out the way he expected, and it kind of went into a spiral of despair or something. I don't know. You also got to realize he's talking about these patents in 04 and 05. Although the Wright brothers flew in 03, it wasn't immediately known that they had been successful. In fact, it wasn't even immediately recognized that they were the first in flight.
Yeah.
There was actually a pretty lively competition going on with them and a gentleman named Langley, who was the head of the Smithsonian there in D.C., and he was trying to fly his own machine, and the Smithsonian had a hard time recognizing the Wright brothers as the first in flight. In fact, a little aside, it wasn't until a couple decades later, when they really wanted to get the Wright Flyer, the first in flight.
Which
if you go to the
see.
Aerospace Museum, you can see it today.
Yeah.
And the only way that was going to happen, because I think Wilbur had died. I think Orville was the only one alive, or maybe it's the other way around. Gosh. But whichever one was still alive said, the only way you're getting it is if you publicly recognize us as the first in flight. So that's when the Smithsonian finally did. The Wright brothers had claimed that, we were the first to fly, so we own the patent for flying. So later on, as other inventors created flying machines, they would sue them for
Copyright infringement.
Infringing their patent. Mm-hmm. So they owned flight. That was the hope. Of course, that didn't. After a lot of legal battles, they lost that battle. So what happened to Custead?
Well, so as I think about it historically, who gets claimed to be the inventor of something?
Right.
I mean, it seems the most important technology here is the video, the ability to capture visual images.
Yeah.
Out of all this story, that's the most important technology because it's the documentation of the Wright's flight.
Yeah.
That
and Kitty Hawk
allows them to do the mic drop on who did it first. It's that documentation of the flight at Kitty Hawk that we've all seen.
Yeah.
So I mean, people can say whatever they want, but I mean, this idea of there is a way to document it now.
Yeah.
Where there wouldn't have been 50 years earlier.
Right. And even with eyewitnesses, that the credibility kind of goes away. I mean, you're only credible as an eyewitness if someone knows you and trusts you. Mm-hmm. So, you get outside of your circle of relationships. Where you're like, they could say anything. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm.
When does Custead re-enter the historical record?
Well,
I mean, what happens?
Yeah. So this is interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's a big, like I said, he kind of goes dark for a while. Mm-hmm. There's a few breadcrumbs along the way. So in 1911 or 1919, he was issued a passport to go to Panama for the object of recreation. So he was 52 years old. And they issued him that passport. And then in 21, he was issued, or his passport was renewed in San Francisco. Don't know where he went after that one. And then actually, again, it was examined, or his passport was examined in New Orleans. So he left San Francisco to go somewhere and then came back into the port of New Orleans. But his last days were spent in Hawaii.
Huh.
So
he did not fly his own plane there.
He did not.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is in the 1930s. I mean, I guess he could have taken a commercial flight.
He took a plane, probably.
He could have taken a commercial flight to Hawaii.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about some of these time frames, and it's crazy. I mean, 1899, nobody's flying. Mm-hmm. By even in the Waco history annals, in 1917, we get an airfield.
Yeah,
and they're training pilots to go fly combat in Europe. So 17, 18 years later, I mean, that's not even a generation. I mean, that's just a few years, seemingly. Yeah. And the progress of flight has been crazy fast. Well, back to our gentleman, Mr. Custead. So this would have been March 17th, 1933. This shows up in a newspaper, the Honolulu Star Bulletin. And the title's going to give it away. Hermit found dead in shack.
Oh, no. Oh, gosh.
But why is that funny?
Well, I'm just saying. I mean, that's just kind of a sad. That's a sad headline.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Nobody aspires to that. So yeah.
So it reads the Hermit of Nanakulai. So he was. Oh, wow. He had his own. He had a title.
Yeah.
He was the Hermit of Nanakulai.
Wow.
William D. Custead, 62, was found dead in the shack near Sunset Camp near Nanakulai Beach Friday. According to this police report, death resulted from natural causes. The body was found by Mrs. Violet Jones he gives her address. When she found he had not been reading newspapers delivered to his door and decided to investigate. Hostile to visitors, Mr. Custead had lived a life of almost absolute seclusion. He wore no clothing when at home and only infrequently made trips to a nearby grocery store to purchase provisions. Most of his food was produced himself, raising chickens and vegetables. Food filled the pots found on the stove led to the belief that Mr. Custead was preparing dinner when he died. Papers found in the shack indicated that Mr. Custead had invested in a considerable amount of money in stocks.
Oh, okay.
So maybe there's a backstory there.
Yeah.
3 sons are said to be living on the mainland. Then it goes on to tell which mortuary they sent him to. So
now these would have been sons from
back in Waco.
back in Waco.
Or Elmont.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why did he spend his last years in seclusion? Who knows? Was it bitter that his success didn't come through? Did he end up finding success somewhere else and the stock market crash put him into seclusion? I mean, there's a lot of horrible stories along those lines. So who knows?
Was our author in the 70s that he was able to track anybody down from the family?
Yeah. He interviewed his son.
Okay.
One of his sons who recalled being a kid and sitting in the machine while it was flying around. He would have been 6 years old or something like that. So, but Pocock, the author, he's like, yeah, I did find some people to interview. I mean, it's 1970s, and that was a long time ago. So, I don't discount them, but the memory has a strange, memories can be strange.
Yeah.
So, in fact, he actually has a little bit of he keeps a summary of his eyewitness reports are in the back of his book. And, talks about, what evidence he could find. I mean, at that time, the shack that he built it in wasn't standing anymore. I mean, things had changed so much. It was almost impossible to find physical evidence at that point. And there were no photographs. I mean, I would say that, of course, we live in a day and age where we have too many photographs of everything.
Of course.
But at that time, having a camera was a special thing. I mean, professionals did that kind of stuff, and I guess for whatever reason, he never thought to have someone come out and photograph his flying machine.
One selfie would have settled it.
Yeah. He should have worked on the iPhone first and then done the airship.
Yeah. So do you believe it? I guess I'll ask you since you've done research.
Okay.
Looked into it.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I actually got into engineering because of my fondness of aeronautics and flight. So that's one reason I was drawn to this story a little bit. And I would say, based on what we know now about the modern physics of flight and what it takes, his device really didn't have a chance. I mean, it maybe in a toy-like sense, like I mentioned before, you can go look at an ornithopter online and see it kind of flutter around, and it's really cool. But you're not going to build that to scale,
Sure.
and put people in it and fly across the ocean.
Yeah.
And I'd say the same thing here.
Yeah.
It just the physics were not going to lend themselves to success. I mean, even today, I mean, there's only a few. He's talking about flapping wings to generate lift. I mean, there's only a few airplanes now that'll even have variable swept wings that are successfully flown, like the B-1 bomber, stuff like that. I mean, it's very rare. I mean, everything is fixed wing.
Yeah.
And even those with variable swept wings, I mean, they're still considered a fixed wing. They just are able to reconfigure. I don't think he had a viable shot at it. But I'm glad he tried, and he tried here in McLennan
it's an
County.
inspiration to all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe not the end part, but the beginning of the story is an inspiration to all of us.
Yeah. Well, so the author, Mr. Pocock, Nick Pocock, he was actually born in London, England, and was an aviation enthusiast. Actually did quite a bit of flying himself. He learned to fly at the London Aeroplane Club and then flew as an Air Force volunteer, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve. So after completing his engineering studies, he continued to fly, and it actually ended up leading him to a job here in Waco. I think he worked at TSTC and was an instructor out there. So that's what brought him to Waco.
Interesting.
Yeah. And he was a member of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, American Aviation Historical Society, Experimental Aircraft Association, and they lived on a farm here in Central Texas. So I think it's really cool that thankfully, back then, was able to pull together the information he did to tell this story.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that he did, and Rick, I'm glad that you chased this rabbit. This has been interesting
it's a very
to get
unique
into.
Story.
As we sat here on the 21st floor of the Alico building, I haven't seen anything fly by that looked like a large flapping canoe.
Yeah,
but
there are. You can look now out on the Brazos. There may be some canoers out there.
Well, and if they got up to speed, who knows what could happen. Yeah. Thanks, Rick.
You bet. A lot of fun.
The Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Reach San Antonio.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.